All right. So, Cybersemiotics, Introduction to Librarianism. This is the table of contents. Oh, I should do slideshow mode. All right. This is the table of contents. All right. So first off, we're going to start off with social media as an information system, right? An information system is an interconnected network of processes that produce, distribute, and manipulate information. Social media as an information system transfers mass amounts of cultural information, oftentimes referred to as memes. Here's a secret thing, though. The definition of a meme, a portmanteau of mimesis and gene, is a false form of understanding the transmission and evolvability of culture, because the meme flow model assumes vertical high-fidelity message transmission analogous to gene flow, hence meme or mimesis and gene, right? But in reality, the transmission often takes discrete and diffuse oblique forms. And in the case of social media, I created a neologism as the oblique computer-mediated communication distributed flow, or the CMC distributed. And another thing that's going to be important later is that systems which are inherently memorable are referred to as basins of attraction by this article, the person I read. Then salience is one of the most important indicators of cultural transmissibility, right? And like maintaining the fidelity of some kind of sign system, described later. But with those terms, discrete and diffuse oblique, right? It's better shown here, right? So direct hereditary is like just, you have a parent, it's teaching, like you send the meme over and like you're teaching these ideas directly to your children, right? And that's like the meme gene flow type of deal. But in reality, what's it called? When it comes to like consolidating cultural information, a lot of times when it's inferential reconstruction is the term. Um, uh, and What's it called? Inferential reconstruction is the term, and it involves, like, if you think about memory as generative, right? Or it's like you instead of just getting the pure information, it comes with a lot of error and a lot of difficulty. Like you see somebody bang a hammer and stuff like that, and it's like it takes a few times of observing other people banging a hammer to, or tying your shoes is a better example. It's like you watch somebody tie their shoes, you don't get that all the way at the first time, right? So you view a few people do it. That's oblique diffuse, right? Oblique discrete is somebody who isn't like your parent, right? So it's like some other tutor, one person giving you information, right? And then your parent giving you, that's like vertical flow, or a bunch of people that you're like getting information from and then being able to combine into some sort of individual schema, right? But the thing about oblique computer mediated communication distributed, right? Or CMC distributed, it's assumed to be oblique. But what happens is that you have these kind of like systems, right, that remove one of the things Steralini talks about is the fact that like information is expensive, right? There's a lot of like social gain, or like social what's it called, like valuation goes into play as you're like learning information. Somebody that this is where Vygotsky comes in. Being the more knowledgeable other is a status a symbol, right? It is actually probably one of the most important forms of status, because that it lies underneath like every single other form of authority, is this idea of like some kind of transcendental knowledge, right? And not even attached to the whole, like you can map it onto the Kabbalah. But so in this case, you have the computer becoming this kind of mediating mechanism to take the information, detach it from the individual, and then distribute it to a big group of people, right? But then these people, you have the reshares, the retweets, right? Or like you share the meme to other people, all these ways in which case the status of more knowledgeable other that would otherwise create like a social ordinal system that derives from that, now it's being grafted onto the computer and the algorithm, and you don't have this like social context, the relationship to the people that produce the information, right? And then you have a lot of stuff coming from like what's it called? Then because it's being sent from another person to you, you're able to discuss it with them. So like the ownership of the information has been alienated, right? But you still have this discussion in relation to the information. And that's where we find a lot of issues, right? And how on Instagram or in a lot of places you can't have effective discussion, because in a lot of ways you don't have domains, or everybody has their own domain specific vocabularies because they're isolated by like their weird echo chamber epistemologies. Um, um, but fucking what was I talking about? So you have the oblique transmission of, well, we can just go to the next thing. So, what is cybersemiotics? A transdisciplinary approach to information, cognition, and communication studies through an integration of Nicholas Lohmann's communication theory with C.S. Peirce's semiotics. That's this guy Soren Breyer. I originally got interested in semiotics because I saw the word on the side of the book and I thought it looked cool. Um, uh, but it turned out to be a lot more interesting. Cybernetics is a study of self-regulating, controlling communication systems, and some keywords are feedback loops, autopoiesis, static dynamic equilibrium, interpenetration, structural coupling, information entropy. Right? What's it called? I'm better with semiotics than cybernetics right now, I would say. But semiotics is the study of how meaning is constructed through the process of interpreting sign systems. So like signifier, signified, that's like the Saussurean model. Then you have like this representation, and then myth, interpretance, and then abductive, inductive, and deductive reasoning, which are important when taking into consideration peers, because there's a very strict, what's it called, divide between Pierce and Saussure as like two different models of semiotics. Um, uh, Key theorists, right? So these are some general, all the people I'm pulling ideas from. There's some more, but yeah, I'll make this slideshow public at some point. So anybody can look at these, but so the goals of semiotics. One of the primary goals of cybersemiotics is to create adaptive information systems that allow for the effective management and manipulation of social information systems, as well as the reconciliation of domain-specific vocabularies. So we can return back to that thing about like the what's it called, the oblique CMC distributed, right? Because of this alienation of the social relationship attached to the information that helps you like index it within that greater like social framework, right? Now it's in this kind of scattered, like neo schizophrenic type where it's like, cyberspace, all the information's just kind of flowing. You're making these kind of associations, right? But without a community to help discuss this stuff with, right? You're building your own idiosyncratic definitions, right? You're not actually like language only makes sense in relation to other people. Language itself is a social what's it called, like artifact, right? You don't have language without sociality. You will have a psychological system and a biological system, but without other people around, you will not develop language, right? You will not develop explicit semantic thought. Um, uh, there's no like inner voice, I guess. And that's one of the things that the ideas from Vygotsky. But so that's why we can think of there being like a continuum then from feeling and to thought that kind of like delimits the edges of the psychological system. But go into that later. So goals of semi-cybernetics. Oh, so then that's the thing is that you have the domain-specific vocabularies that are developed because of this idiosyncratic definition making that comes from the fact that the social information is alienated from any sort of like relational community that allows you to like center yourself or whatever and actually use that information. It's like you can't learn a language without using the words with other people, but okay, so given that cybernetics is a study of communication and control of information, semiotics concerns the consumption and production of this information, a process. Given that cybernetics is a study, semiotics concerns the consumption and production of this information, a process of interpretation that is consolidated into cultural behavior by a process of inferential reconstruction. I might have written this sentence bad. Semiotics concerns the consumption and production of. Oh, yeah, that's what it is. The consumption and production of information is a process of interpretation that is consolidated into cultural behavior by a process of inferential reconstruction. Sorry, I forgot what that sentence was. Anyway, real quick, are people getting this? Is this tracking? Am I going
Yeah,
too
I'm
fast?
mostly following it, but I also feel like that I'm a bad target audience to ask because I know you and I have had like personal discussions on this quite a lot. So
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm getting yeah. I just had a question.
yeah, any questions?
Well, yeah, like what are you like when you were mentioning that idiosyncratic sort of definition making, sort of creating this disconnect between each other and like everybody has their own definitions of like the things you're interacting with in the world. right? Through
Yeah.
this like diffuse use of social media. That reminds me a lot of Wittgenstein.
Yeah, yes. Wittgenstein is very important in here. He's quoted heavily in Soren Breyer's book.
Okay, I was gonna say
Yeah.
because like if these
Mhm.
guys just like rediscovered like what he talked about,
No,
I haven't
I
picked up the
should
book
have,
yet, but yeah.
let me add Wittgenstein in there too. No, he's been quoted a lot, I just forgot it. I haven't read him directly though, but
Oh,
he is
okay. I was
very
gonna say because like
important.
his idea of language games, that's exactly what this is, and this sort of like battle for like meaning. And he argued that there is no
No,
such thing as an individual way to speak to yourself, like these idiosyncratic definitions, because then
yeah.
it just incoherence.
Yeah, that's what it is. You can think about speech community. Each speech community has their own language game, and you have to play the. In order to play the game, you have to have other people to learn the same rules. You need to
Yeah,
share
there
rules,
there
right?
has to be yeah. There's not only the rules, but something to like sort of work together with, because like the fact that we have words that mean something shows that we're not alone in the reality that we exist in. That's what Wittgenstein argued. Like if we can like because the whole beetle in the box idea. Like if we all had a beetle in a something called a beetle in a box, and each of us had something, but it was different, and each person just called that thing a beetle, the word would be meaningless.
Yeah,
What's
Uh,
actually very interesting is somebody in there was a talk earlier in the negative maps server on Deleuze Guattari and on Spinoza, and somebody else completely independently also brought up the beetle in the box theory on language. So it's very interesting how it's cropped up twice.
It's interesting because like Fro, when you and I talked about some of this stuff like was it, like a month or so ago, I was like I was like this sounds so much like Wittgenstein, but we didn't talk about that. And then I remember like it's helping me understand it because like this relationship, it also this relationship between people becoming like increasingly incoherent as they sort of
yeah,
further isolate their ability to interact, and play these language games. And the pool of people they're playing these games with gets smaller. And it just like made me think. Like grabbed a Sharpie while you were flying through things, and I asked my partner for it, so I wrote it down quick. But like it reminds me of all of the misdefinitions and all of the bickering and rhetoric that's being used around like varying, like definitions. Like the biggest definition war
yeah,
I've ever seen
yeah.
is over
Mhm.
racism, for example. Like
Yeah,
to me that
yeah.
like and it's all online and it's just bizarre. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, I just
It
wanted
is
to
pretty crazy. It
clarify
is pretty
before
crazy.
before you went on.
Yeah, that is yes. Um, but yeah, so the term language games is a good one to what's it called use in this context. And then what's it called? So where are we? Theorist.
If you're comfortable with it, Fro, what I can do is I could like cut in or not to take over or anything, but like
Yeah,
whenever it gets dense, I can like try and explain. I can try and be a bridge between understanding, I suppose. Because I
yeah, okay,
obviously because yeah, the this is really dense stuff, right? It's not
yeah,
because it's meant to be impenetrable. It's just because it's the content itself is so interdisciplinary
yeah,
that it can be on the surface quite alienating. Like it's not exactly obvious what a lot of these things mean. Like even
yeah,
though we can break down the term socio-communicative autopoetic language games and it means something to us, it's not exactly
yeah,
obvious what it means just by saying it out loud.
Yeah,
yeah. It's
I was gonna say
definitely
it's kind of like looking at a really dank meme and laughing, and then your partner's like, "What's funny?" And you're like, "I'd have to
You wouldn't
explain
get
like
it. I'm so jaded.
three tiers worth of memes like to get them to get the
yeah,
joke." But no, this sounds fascinating. I really
Mhm.
appreciate you doing this.
yeah. And it's what's it called? And that example you just gave about the fact that you had to teach all of this stuff and really like in order to understand the meme, right, in a
Mhm.
specific context, that's actually exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, because what we have here is this is you have this history, right? You have this history that you attach to the meme to help like define and understand it. But the process that you go about building that history, right? So it's like you have this historical knowledge, right? But the thing is that this memory that's attached to it, it's inferentially reconstructed. That's the thing is that memory. Oh, I'll get into the I go into it more later, but you can think of the fact that like because every time that you remember something, you're remembering it for the first time, somewhat, kind of, right? It's like you're remembering it with the context of the knowledge that you're having right now, and you use your whole Gestalt brain, or like it's the fact that it's so connectionist, right? Is that every time you remember something, there's more information like in relation to it, right? It's never just storage, right? I don't store this cup in my head perfectly, right? It's like every time I generate it, it's like I have this memory that's associated with it. But when you imagine something, it's not just a visual even. Like the more that you observe it, you're constructing it, you're building it. Memory is generative and creative at all times. Um, um, let's see. So, uh, uh, um, and then so that relates to the memes because of the fact that it's like this generation, right? This knowledge construction. It's like what are the systems that you're using to draw that information from in order to like build this like, ideation of the meme, right? And it's like that's dependent on like, your prior historical understanding, but then also what like the present, it's like the stream, right? You're scrolling and the stream and the context, right? All of this goes into like understanding the syntagmatic flow of these images. Because what we're most concerned with isn't the singular meme, right? I don't care about how this one meme is like creating a meaning in your head. Because what actually matters is how like the gestalt, like what is your, it's the ismatic is a term that I've been using. Ismatic is it's like a pejorative for like being addicted to isms, fads, and theories, right? But if we think about like an addiction, right? But if we think about our current era, information itself is highly addictive, right? It's like just sliding on Instagram, just looking at the news, just getting a fuck ton of spectacle from the last Marvel movie, right? So it's like what happens is that we have these addictive flows of information, these systems that by nature of us interacting with them generate pleasure or challenge or just they fulfill desire and they what's it called they help or aid in desiring production if you want to say that they're excitatory they're what's it called but so the issue here is that we fall onto these pathways because our consumption of information and what becomes pleasurable, right, depends on the prior information that we've seen before and that we agree with, the mythology, right? Because it's like if I've seen a lot of democratic stuff, right, a lot of shit from, just whatever CNN, I'm exposed to that constantly. My parents are into it. I have this history that becomes the context that I'm done observing eating memes from, right? But it's like if what's it called? Because the history dictates, then and that's what's being generative. Yeah, the ismatic, right? So that's the thing is that you have this addictive process that over time starts to like pigeonhole you into like this specific like pathway, your pipelines, your content pipelines, right? Because that's what the modern era is about. Is that it's not even just these like um uh, what's it called? Like categorization systems, these like disciplinary systems that are supposed to delimit different like groups, right? Now it's all about producing demographics, right? It's like we have these predictive mechanisms that got so powerful that now they're able to actually aggressively try to take vulnerable groups and then mold them towards certain areas of extremes, right? And in that process, of moving towards the extreme because it's dependent on individual inferential reconstruction without a social community, right? What you're getting is just this funneling point, isolating your whole language, your idea of it all disappears. You're not talking to anybody anymore because you literally don't have you're not saying that you're not agreeing on the same words, the same events, the same histories. When you bring up some sort of social figure, right? It's so scattered that for one person you're talking about a demon, right? You're talking about somebody that drinks children's blood. The other person is just a boring bureaucrat, right? To another person, it's a fucking neoliberal asshole, right? But what's it called? Those are some of the methods that were being kind of like attached to these ismatics. If we use ismatic similar to schematic, right? And then an ismatic because it's ism, you can attach that ismatic suffix to any ism, right? And then you can try to think about okay, So you have like a primitivismatic, right? If you wanted to sketch like the pipelines of addictive information consumption in relation to primitivism, right? Or what's it called? Fucking, and some other ism, incelismatic. But the most important one, obviously, that's in the title of this thing is the capitalismatic. What are the addictive cycles of information consumption that contribute to the maintenance and control? What's it called? Let's see. Where were we? Goal of cybersemiotics. Okay, so one of the primary goals of cybersemiotics is create adaptive information systems that allow for the effective management and manipulation of social information as well as the reconciliation of domain-specific vocabularies. And that's what the issue is, right? That's what I described earlier, right? It's developing these domain-specific vocabularies. The domain is your head, and you do not want it to be too specific to your head, because then it doesn't make sense to their head. And that's whoever's screen that I'm pointing to, because or actually it would probably be this end if I don't know. There's the grids. But anyway, let's see. So and that's what leads to, a bunch of other irritating stuff related to the internet. Okay, so given his cultural behavior, inferential reconstruction. Okay, so that's the goal of cybersemiotics. Um, so semiosis and cognition. A sign is something which represents something else. Semiosis is the process of signification in which meaning is assigned to a sign. So you have signs. Semiosis is the processing of these signs, right? Cognition is a process of comprehending such signification and using them to construct a model for reality. So C.S. Peirce, there's Peirce versus Saussure. Peirce is representamen, signify or representamen, referent, and then interpretant, right? And Saussure is just signifier and signified. So we see that the difference between Peirce and Saussure is that Peirce has the referent and the object, right? And so the thing is with Saussure, what happens is that you just have signifier, signified, right? And so it becomes like just a purely Echo talks about this in his theory of semiotics about like the referential fallacy, which makes it so that in the theory of codes, you don't need a referent or an object. It actually starts to distort the understanding of it because a code is it would a when you have a social code, right, and you wanted to describe it or like let's say you were to graph it out or represent it, you would be able to, 'cause it's a static thing, right? A code has it's like if you were to understand like what's it called? It's like if you were to have an individual whatever, it doesn't matter. But the thing is that if you had like a symbol in the Saussurean sense is there's just an arbitrary connection to something based on social convention, right? It's like a cup means a cup because other people told you it is a cup. And that is just where it stops. Everything is just arbitrary associations. Everything is symbolic. That is Saussure, right? But that's weak because the thing is that there's actually a whole gradient of different levels of like iconicity, indexicity, right? It's like things aren't purely just symbolic. Names are not entirely arbitrary, right? We have like a whole series of like cognitive semantic devices that were drawing from qualitative experience to help generate these kind of like labelings and otherwise, right? Or at least like the way that we represent stuff because we're not dealing specifically with language, we're dealing with all different forms of representation now.
Is
um
this
uh
all similar to the phenomena of, I think everyone might have encountered this one before, Kiki versus Boba, where there was a language game that scientists did where they showed people across a wide range of languages and cultures through shapes and said, hey, we have two names for these shapes, Kiki and Boba. Which words would you use for which shape? And
yeah,
90% of participants across a range of languages and cultures, which have lots of different weights on certain phenomena and other phenomena and have different rules within their language, but 90% of participants agreed with each other that the spiky shape was a Kiki and the
yes,
rounded blobby shape was a Boba.
that's exactly what I'm talking
Mhm.
about, and
So
that
it's
is
not that, yeah,
awesome that you
not that
brought
the
that up.
words are arbitrary, but that there are
Mhm.
other rules behind why we use them.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of it comes from sense experience. That's a big thing. In fact, the theory is that you have this, interdependent system of sense experience and semantic experience. But so and episodic memory and semantic memory. But so what's it called? But yeah, so Pierce has an object that's referring to. It's grounding it inside of some sort of sensational and concrete reality, right? And then I think that's where I read somewhere, I didn't finish the article, but you notice I didn't put Deleuze in here. Deleuze is a cyberneticist. I'm currently reading Anti-Oedipus, but I'm not too good at to understand it
We're all
fully.
currently reading Anti-Oedipus. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad for that. But apparently that's one of the things, so is that Deleuze has a different relationship with the object than Pierce does. But it still has an object though. But yeah, so having the object here allows you to turn it into like, instead of just purely like I think it's hermeneutic or like, linguistic analysis, now you can actually start to ground it in cognitive science and expand it to like, um uh trying to draw from actual material reality. Um uh so then after this we have this. Okay, and then this is the how to elaborate on it is that this is so a sign is anything which is related to a second thing, its object in respect to a quality in such a way as to bring a third thing, its interpretant into relation to the same object, and then in such a way as to bring a fourth into relation to that object in the same form ad infinitum, right? So it's like you have the triggering object, right? That then creates a object, right? Then representation that turns into an interpretant, right? Which in itself becomes an object of contemplation, which can then be used to generate another interpretant, right? So you see this process, and it's all still referring to the same triggering object, but that's how we start to turn this like semiotic process into like one of motion, right? It's like, it's a flow as opposed to just like this static, like ontological categorization of things. Things happen on a continuum now, right? Because you see that it's like the rima, decent, and argument. That's another trichotomy that Pierce makes. He loves the number three. Um, uh, um, but what's it called? It's like there's what's it called, like the quality or the iconic, like the feeling based, right? Which is then abstracted eventually into its symbolic form. So there's icon, index, and then symbol, right? So then symbol is that arbitrary, like social convention based understanding, right? And how we understand, like words are symbolic, right? But then a picture of a dog would be iconic because the picture very much so resembles the dog according to sense experience, right? And then it's like an index, right? Would be smoke resembles fire because, or smoke doesn't resemble it, but smoke indicates fire because of its existential relationship to fire, right?
Is
But the
sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Is similar to iconography within language. So how the difference between essentially, say, hieroglyphics, even though
yeah,
hieroglyphics are a language ostensibly, and English, where English uses a script, and through the script you abstract, where the symbols are abstract representations of words. Rather, they're pointing towards letters and words. They're not pointing towards things. Whereas a hieroglyph, or say kanji, Chinese kanji,
yeah,
is trying to be a literal pictographic representation of the thing. Why
yeah,
the kanji of a tree looks suspiciously like a tree, and the kanji for forest is two trees, and the kanji for dense wood is three trees.
yeah,
It's meant to be a more quite literal symbol rather than a pointing towards an abstraction, which is another abstraction.
yeah,
Mm,
yep, that's it. Yeah,
mm.
yeah. You do understand this pretty well.
Yeah.
I guess we have talked about this a lot.
Well,
Um, uh,
I'm also pointing this out for other people. I'm wondering if it's
yeah,
still true.
okay, that
Yeah.
works. Um, but let's see, where were we? Parallel semiosis, object interpretant discourse. Yeah, so then that's how things. It's like, um, uh, you know what? Let me bring up. I think I even forgot to bring up the most important picture. I didn't even put it on the slide. Um, this is the horrible graph that I posted at one point. Do you guys see it? This one?
Oh, this one. I stared at this one for like fucking 20 minutes when
You
I
see
first.
this one, right?
Yeah.
So we can think about, right? So by the end of this, you should probably be able to understand all of this, right? But so this process, right? This one from like the Ream phenomenological understanding to like social and then like semantic understanding, right? Or like linguistic specifically. I would actually think it would yeah, linguistic understanding and then to thought transmission, right? So that's how you can think of that as existing right here in like the phenosemiotic realm, right? And then instinctual signification is that which is produced by intrasemiotics, which is like the communication system that links the what's it called, the biosemiotic or also endosemiotic to the phenosemiotic, which would be the psychological. So it's like you have the psychological autopoietic system, the biological autopoietic system, and they're structurally coupled via this like process of what's it called, like semiotic um interpenetration, right? Or these separate processes. It's like you have biological, psychological, and then the sociological, which is the big sphere. But in order for this to get to this, you have a system within the biological system. So it's like, think about like your cells are always signaling to each other, right? DNA is a signaling device, right? There's semiotics intrinsic to just biology, all these ways that they signal to each other and like make these signs, right? They don't have these higher level interpretations, but that's why it's structural couplings of the endosemiotic system, right? Which then, what's it called? Through coupling with the phenosemiotic, right? This intrasemiotics, that's where you have like your biological organisms interacting with your nervous system to create this kind of like qualitative feeling, right? And that would be the instinctual signification, right? Instinct, feeling, non-linguistic thought and like conscious experience, right? And then as you start to isolate things into like or like and more flow, right? Instinct is more flow, concept is now divided. The machines have cut things, right? Split up the flux. And then that's where you get thought semiotics, which is like what's it called? The interpenetration between what's it called? The phenosemiotic system and then the cultural signification sphere, which can also be thought of as the social semiotic system or like the autopoietic social system as a whole. But and that's kind of how this ladder works. And then you have individuals talking to each other through sign games, as well as cybernetic languaging through signals, right? So the non-linguistic or non-semiotic, it's just what's not like picked up by perception. This also includes this is where we get away from the linguistic determinism. This includes just material circumstance, right? This attaches you to the world. Suddenly language actually hits the concrete, right? Same cybernetic languaging through signals, structural couplings. Because it's like you have your endosemiotic system, but it's communicating constantly with the world around it. That's that structural coupling, right? Constantly with other systems. And then you can get really wild with it when we start thinking about like, the differential henology stuff. And that's where this model could be expanded upon. Because I don't think Soren Breyer was thinking about differential henology. He doesn't cite Deleuze once.
Don't be too upset if you don't understand the graph. I'm pretty sure the people who made it also don't understand it. It's a
Yeah.
very complex. It involves many different systems working at different levels. So
Yeah.
it's a bit impenetrable, but that's only because it sort of represents cybersemiotics in general as being a little bit impenetrable sometimes.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But okay. So now we have I gotta explain autopoiesis. But so anyway, so the gradient of semiotic complexity abstracts perceived qualities of sense experience into symbolic arguments and discourse. Right? This is similar to the interdependence of episodic and semantic memory, which finds itself neurologically represented as a gradient distribution. Right? So it's like what's it called? Gradient. I had a good definition of gradient.
I think it's called gradients. Yeah.
Gradients. No.
It's
But
gradients.
no, it's not. Gradient.
I thought
What?
it was called like gradients.
The word is
I
gradient.
thought that it was called gradient. All right. Yeah, thanks, man. Sorry if I like sound like a news.
It's all good, man. It's all good. But the way that we're doing this is that we're trying to only interrupt if you are confused about something and have an explicit question. We're trying to refrain from comments right now
Right,
until
yeah,
we
I
get
was
to the end.
I was
And
kind of like
that also
confused on I was
includes.
kind of confused.
Sounds good. Okay. Um. Okay, so we have the similar to the interdependence of episodic and semantic memory, which finds itself neurologically um, uh, represented as a gradient distribution, right? So in that case, I'll get into that further when it actually gets in the memory section. But you can think about the fact that the brain actually shows, right, through its like the structure of its networks, right, the networks that are associated with semantic memory and the networks that are associated with what's it called, uh, episodic memory. Uh, they're both active at the same time and intermingled with each other and the default mode network, right? But the way that at least the way that they found, there is that kind of gradient that kind of shows this like precession or of like episodic to semantic memory, because episodic it's like you have all your episodic memory and that's repeated and that's your sense experience, right? And over time you abstract these patterns through this process that you're seeing here on the graph, right? And then derive that into the semantics, and the semantics themselves are then structured like through symptomatic and paradigmatic relationships in order to like create metaphorical embodied I'll get into it later, but then the semantic memory triggers more episodic memory, and then you have this tumbling of interdependent, like both systems are always functioning. It's not like a particular like one or the other trade-off at any point. It's not modular. Um, uh, so then here's the autopoietic. Autopoiesis, different elements of a system interact in ways that produce and reproduce the elements required to maintain the functioning of the system, right? So it's like it came originally from Maturana, originally just referred to living systems, like how biological, it was a way to try to define life, that like living systems are self-maintaining. They build the components or produce the components used to, you know, maintain themselves, right? And so this also relates to this. This is where we start bringing cybernetics, so that the system must self-regulate and adapt to disturbances, right? So this could be visualized in the form of a cybernetic feedback loop, and the fact that you have this like self-regulating system that produces its own, like it produces the resources as necessary to like cancel out some kind of disturbance, and this disturbance is any deviation from the norm that is modeled by the system's like control mechanisms or whatever, right? Control protocols. But so a structural coupling is environmental events can trigger internal processes, but the concrete structures triggered are determined by the structures of the system. And that's one of the ways. That's how we can think about the relationship between living systems, psychic systems, and social systems. They're all autopoietic, right? And they all influence each other, and this also kind of gets what's it called? It gets a bit away from like the Cartesian dualism, because it all becomes part of the same process,
Uh-huh.
right? It's like you have what's it called? Um, uh, uh, I'm gonna mute
I
you.
think it's called
You're kind of loud. Can you mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So then so yeah, so the three systems are structurally coupled, and the semiotics are what are what's it called? That's the point of semiotics, is to allow for that structural coupling of these systems, allow them to communicate with each other. So that's how you can think that what's it called? Uh, uh, well, we can just move on. System cognition, autopic social systems. Okay, here's an example of a cybernetic feedback loop, right? So if you think that this is an organism, right, that's wanting to, this is an organism that wants to maintain itself, right? Um, uh, uh, so it has a referent, it has a goal state that it's constantly referring to, and that's set by just kind of, if instead of you thinking that there's like some sort of like, you know commander that's like trying to dictate and visualize a goal state. It's more so you have all of these dynamic systems that are all like what's it called, like structurally coupled to each other, right? So the goal state or the referent it's kind of something that's also being generated as well, right? So it's like you have systems that are generating the referent as well as what's it called? Regulating the inputs and outputs of the system. And that's kind of part of how you have like an adaptive evolutionary system. But so anyway, you have output that or you have a disturbance, right, which is monitored by the system, which is compared to the goal state, which then what's it called is creates an output of some sort of produced object, right, at a certain rate to counteract the disturbance, and then to maintain what maintain state with the goal state, right? Um, uh, so then the way that we can think about this, right, is that you're trying to maintain this equilibrium within the system where there's two different kinds of equilibrium. There's static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. Static equilibrium is when there's stasis on the molecular level. Now we're using a Deleuzian term, right? But if you have like, let's say, you have like all these different, you have a machine and nothing's happening, right? And then nothing happens. That's it, right? But dynamic equilibrium, on the other hand, is when you have like a system, right? But it has flows going through it. There's movement, right, and different activity. But the thing is that because they are in opposition of each other, they negate each other, which results in a molar stasis, right? So even though you have all of this activity on the molecular level, there still isn't a change in the system because it's effective at producing the right flows to cancel, right, the disturbances out. So that's an effective system is one that's able to maintain dynamic equilibrium, right? And it has to do that actively by being able to monitor things, right? And then produce flows counter to those disturbances to be able to return to some sort of goal state, which it is also generating in relate. It gets kind of bizarre, but anyway, you can think about capital as being an autopoietic social system. It is the or capitalism, right?
Would a good example of a dynamic equilibrium be like a river, where how there's constant movement of water through the river always flows from a source, it always flows into the ocean, and yet the river tends never to like go over the riverbank, right? It always tends to stay within itself. Is that a good example of a system of dynamic equilibrium, or is that a bit too?
I think it Um, uh, when I think about a system of a like dynamic equilibrium, it's like when you have like, you know, if you have a box, right? And you got
Mhm,
like one person pushing on the box this way, another person pushing on the box this way. It's like static equilibrium is the box is just sitting there, right?
mhm.
And dynamic equilibrium is if I'm pushing on the box this way and you're pushing on this way, and still the box is not moving, right?
Okay.
You have these forces on it, but it's still not moving, and that's one of the big things later when we get into like pseudo cyclical time.
Mm,
Is this idea of a dynamic equilibrium of social activity?
okay.
Um, uh, and a big reason for that is because of the domain-specific vocabularies that
Mm,
keep people from being able to develop advanced cognitive structure or advanced socio-cognitive structures. Now we're with narrative and memory, and now things should start to kind of pull together a little bit. Collective memory are the shared memories of a community. History can serve as a reservoir of symbols to draw from when generating a life narrative, right? So that's two ways to think about collective memory is the shared memories of a community, right? But then also as history itself is made up of all of these collective memories, and history is okay. Stereotypical compression as a means of to forming archetypes, right? So the abstract semanticization of the episodic experience of the other. So when we think about stereotypes, right, what they are is that you're experiencing all of these episodic sensations, right? You see all of these people, right? And then over time, you observe a pattern between them according to some sort of attribute, right? And then you start to associate a meaning with that, what's it called? That abstract, like, conception of having that attribute, right? What's it called? And so then that becomes the abstract semantization of the episodic experience of the other. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. It reminds me actually a lot of how people have ready-made stereotypes even before they have language to sort
Yeah.
of explain these stereotypes away, which is why when people interact with systems like MBTI for the first time or astrology and horoscopes for the first time, they see this ready-made bank of stereotypes that they can suddenly use to express the stereotypes that they already held in the first place. And
Yeah.
it's like this language which is there, which if everyone engages and buys into the system of horoscopes, then suddenly people feel like a massive amount of connection because they can, express all these stereotypes that they all held long
Yeah.
before, long before they encountered astrology.
Yeah, that's exactly it, and it's what you're building, through that kind of, like, stacking on connotation to a certain social type, or what is initially a denotative system. So your
Mm,
sense experience, right, that's a denotative system. You
yeah.
have the thing, right, and you have a non-semanticized object or non-semiotized object, right? Semiosis has not taken place on the deck of cards that I haven't even looked at, that nobody's looking at. It is really just an inert thing of stuff, right? But as soon as you look at it, you're denoting some sort. And once you look at it and then distinguish it as something worthy of like semantic valuation, then what's it called? Once you identify it as something worthy of semantic valuation, then you are distinguishing it from other objects, able to assign it meaning, and that starts the process of infinite semiosis, as I was talking about earlier. Why a pierce is more interesting than a soar is because it's grounded in that object and then generates upward. The interpretant is continuously recycled, continuously reimagined, right? Until you start to raise further conceptual ideas, right? It's like, look at the cup. I'm starting to understand there's something about this cup that makes it a cup. Cupness, becoming cup, and then cup. Idea of the cup, and then it's always been cup, right? All of history. When I look back on my memories, suddenly I'm thinking, and I'm thinking about all these other times that the cup was there. Suddenly the cup is everywhere. That's the
Mm,
power of semantics, right? Is
God.
because it's atemporal.
There's
Words
uh,
slice through everything.
mhm.
Yeah.
If I could like steal 30 seconds, I hate to do this,
Oh,
but there's and this is completely self-masturbatory, but this reminds me of an aphorism of society and the spectacle. I'm not
okay.
going to say
I can allow that. I can. Yeah, that
you
works.
can thank you, Matt, bro. But there's an aphorism. I forget if it's 73 or 74. It's one of the first few of chapter 4, where it speaks about. In fact, you know what? I've got the book right here. If you give me 2 seconds, but it speaks about being thrown into history all of a sudden, where
Yeah.
we think of history as a historical epoch, right? You can go back, say, 700 years and be like, oh, yeah, the 15th century, that was 700 years ago. Or, sorry, the 13th century would have been 700 years ago. Um, oh, so that's history, there's a historical epoch. But actually, history is being thrown into history every moment.
Hmm.
And the reason I bring this up is because yeah, sorry, it is aphorism 73. It's the very last sentence. Whatever was absolute becomes historical.
Yeah.
And this is the whole idea of when you learn a new word, it's almost as if that word has always existed, but like you've
Hmm.
just learned it.
Yeah.
So what is it that's always existed? It's not the
Yeah.
word, certainly, because you just experienced that. But that's the interesting thing. It becomes historical the moment you learn it.
Hmm.